Captain John Smith, set out on an exploration of the Chesapeake Bay to map it and to search for silver and gold. Captain Smith encountered the Patuxent River among all of the rivers that he visited, and actually proceeded up the Patuxent River as far north as a waterway we now call Hall's Creek. Left a copper marker there, claiming the land for the King of England, and then proceeded south. He encountered some 13 Native American settlements, and one of those settlements was called Toscos, which is, or believed to be, in the vicinity of modern-day Cox Creek, which is just south of the modern-day town of Lower Marlborough, Maryland. But settlement of the Patuxent River in what is now Calvert County did not begin until 1640, when a fellow named Leonard Leonardson received a grant and established himself on St. Leonard Creek. Some years later, when land grants in the vicinity of what is now Lower Marlborough were granted to a number of settlers between what we call Chews Creek and Graham's Creek. The consequence of this is that these lands gradually became occupied by settlers whose primary goal was to farm the land, and the primary crop, indeed almost the only crop, was tobacco. The 1683 Acts for the Improvement of Trade created some 32 towns throughout the Chesapeake, Maryland tidewater. All of these were to be ports for export. One of the towns that was designated was on the western shore of the Patuxent River in Calvert County, on the shores of Coxtown Creek. It never really got off the ground. By the end of the New Towns programs in 1756, over 130 seaports, ports of entry, would be created in Maryland. One of those towns that was established was to be on the Hardesty lands, the old Hardesty lands, in between Chews Creek and Graham Creek. It was to become the town of Lower Marlborough. Now, at the same time, other towns are created on the river. A town was created on the western branch further upriver, and it was to become later the county seat of the new county of Prince George's. In the early 1700s, the Duke of Marlborough had led the British in war on the European continent, and at the Battle of Blenheim had won himself enormous fame, and at the time was one of the most famous men in the English-speaking world, indeed in the entire Western world. And both towns sought the name of Marlborough. So in that same year, these two towns were created. The only way to differentiate them was to create Upper and Lower Marlborough. The towns were created for warehousing, not for people. But because of the increase in trade, these designated towns become centers for the transit, where you have people coming, bringing their tobacco to the towns for transshipment. They store it in the warehouses. There is a growth of community in terms of support facilities. So by the 1720s, Lower Marlborough is not a town in the way we think of a town today, but it is a very minor center for commerce. All of this changes as the tobacco quality goes sour. There's a lot of fraud in shipping tobacco now. Tobacco has to be weighed. You need somebody who has to account for it. You need counting houses. And a new system, which is called the factor system, has entrenched itself. And the factor system is basically where European firms send their agents to be permanent residents of a town or a community and to manage the trade with the plantations. So no more do the planters have to deal with the ships. Lower Marlborough starts to attract a number of factors to the town. But the frauds that are being initiated against the buyers are proliferating. So in 1747, the government enacts a tobacco inspection law. The 1747 inspection law designated various ports, various places throughout the colony as inspection stations. 3 inspection stations were erected in the county, and one of those stations was the port of Lower Marlborough. And the consequence is that it becomes a destination point. And where you have a destination point, you have a growth. Not too long after this, people start to migrate and live in the town. One of those fellows was a fellow named Captain John David. Now, John David was a seaman. He owned his own ship. He conducted an operation in the town, later operating a ferry, an ordinary. Mariners would come to Lower Marlborough, and a number of them would take up residence. One of the establishments that is created, a fellow who created a manor house called Patuxent Manor. Later this becomes Graham Manor. Graham is one of the most important men in the colony. Graham is married well. His relatives are married well. He holds very important positions in the colony assembly. And his house, this house, is one of the premier houses in Lower Marlborough. It is where business is done. Graham owns property on the waterfront. He has outbuildings. He has an out kitchen. He has slaves. And Graham is among the first to become engaged in the slave trade in 1760 in the port of Lower Marlborough. So thereafter, Lower Marlborough starts becoming a slave importation port. The town is a destination point for literally scores of ships that come into the Patuxent River. They come up to Lower Marlborough. Many of these vessels would stay for long periods of time. And the lord of the ship is the captain. And the scum of the ship, the lowest on the chain, are the seamen. And ships are frequently dictatorships and very cruel environments. So when a ship pulls into this paradise, desertion is a frequent incident that happens. Lower Marlborough was a great desertion port. It had a number of ordinaries here. You could rent horses here. If you disappeared in the countryside with your horse and went west, who was to know? It was a maritime town. There was shipbuilding on the waterfront now. In 1775, a gentleman arrives in Lower Marlborough to establish a small school, and his school is to teach languages and arithmetic. And it is the foundation of what later becomes the Lower Marlborough Academy, which becomes one of the first schools, the first school, in what becomes the state of Maryland. The Lower Marlborough Academy eventually becomes the training ground for a number of prominent Marylanders. Among them is a man named Claggett, who becomes the first Episcopal bishop in the United States, and later the chaplain for the United States Senate. Another man named Kent becomes a congressman, and then 3 times governor of the state of Maryland. So Lower Marlborough's graduates, shall we say, become some of the influential men of Maryland history, and indeed American history. As Lower Marlborough progresses in its prosperity, people have more money to spend on recreation. And one of the great recreational things that people spend their money on is gambling. Maryland is one of the great states known for its horse racing. And in 1765, Lower Marlborough hosts on a track a half a mile long its first horse racing. We're not exactly sure where the track was, but we believe it was on the Graham estate somewhere.